Command & Conquer, or CNC, the series that really helped popularize the real-time strategy genre, or the RTS genre, a break-off of the turn-based strategy genre now offering real-time combat. It's also a series that I played the first entry in, though on the N64 platform of all places. Now, I know.
What a story, Mark.
But despite my strange entry into the series, I was told about it from my uncle, who waxed poetic about Command & Conquer. Command & Conquer originally launched back in 1995, and over the course of the next 20 years would put out over a dozen different titles spread out over the Tiberium, Red Alert, and General's worlds. Many of these titles would help further popularize and revolutionize the RTS genre. But along the way, the Command & Conquer series would also attempt to venture outside of its normal RTS genre confines with shooters, hybrid games, and even MMOs. And much like their major competitor, StarCraft with Blizzard, they would struggle to find footing with any of these titles. Worse, over time, with the popularity of the franchise fading overall, subsequent major titles from 2009 and after would further splinter the fanbase with titles that were rated the worst in the series yet. Although there was a recent successful Command & Conquer Remaster collection that contains the first game and Red Alert that dropped in 2020, there hasn't been a successful major Command & Conquer title in over 15 years. With EA owning the key to the franchise and the last games besides the remaster being EA-led failures, the chances of Command & Conquer as a series further thriving is incredibly low, if not impossible at this point. That's why we're featuring the entire series of Command & Conquer, including the most recent failures on the Death of a Game series, a series where we take a timeline of events and search for the most important clues concerning what the largest contributing factors for a game or company's death is. But as you probably already guessed it, this is a special episode, not just because we're covering the entire series of Command & Conquer, but because not all episodes in the Death of a Game series are about just straight-out failures. Some document the major successes more so. Command & Conquer as a series is all of that. It's success, failure, and somewhere in between. But most tragically, it's a series that has fallen on some serious hard times lately, at least in the modern sense. So many people, myself included, when first beginning this case, wanted to know what happened to the Command & Conquer series. The series that effectively helped popularize the real-time strategy games. Now, detectives, what faction campaign was your favorite throughout the series, whether you hail from the Brotherhood of Nod or the Global Defense Initiative? Or maybe even one of those third factions that got introduced. Start mining your resources, detectives, because we've got a major case to solve.
Incoming transmission.
I'd like to welcome this video's sponsor. Game of Thrones Kingsroad is the official Game of Thrones action-adventure RPG based on the TV series and A Song of Ice and Fire novels. Set during Season 4, the game introduces a brand new story that expands the world of Westeros through thrilling combat, political intrigue, and deep character progression. Developed for both PC and mobile, Kingsroad supports seamless crossplay and cross-progression, allowing players to pick up their adventure across platforms. Explore the Seven Kingdoms and roam vibrant cities like King's Landing, some of the untamed landscapes beyond the wall, and more hidden towns filled with unique quests and moments. With an immersive open world that allows you to explore and experience the beauty and danger of Westeros as well. With added replayability in the form of exploration and crafting, allowing for gear customization and character growth. Utilizing an ARPG combat system and the ability to dodge and counterattack your opponents, the combat in Game of Thrones Kingsroad allows you to experience high-quality gameplay with exceptional polish. There's even class-based combat where each class fights very specifically, like a knight with a longsword or a sellsword using raw and destructive combat inspired by things like wildlings and the Dothraki. In the multiplayer mode, Altar of Memories, players can team up to battle these powerful monsters like ice spiders, stormhorn unicorns, ironbeak griffins, and even red cockatrices. There's so much more to discover, so check the link in description for more information on how to play for free and step into the world of Westeros and forge your legend anytime, anywhere. Thanks for sponsoring the video, Game of Thrones Kingsroad, and back to the case. The story begins with humble beginnings, a story not unlike the forming of Apple and many other successful current tech companies, with a garage, two nerds, Lewis Castle and Brett Sperry, and an idea to make video games, including featuring major IP licenses. Originally formed as Brillis Software in 1985 before becoming the Westwood Studios that we all know it as today, Brillis would put out multiple BattleTech, Dungeons & Dragons, and other games that were successful for many years. This would lead to them, within just 7 years, attracting some big investors and publishers interested in the budding video game tech company. Sierra Entertainment was one of those interested in Westwood Studios. However, Sperry and Castle would choose to sell to Virgin Interactive, who also had a US office instead, citing a potential for greater freedom and autonomy. This ended up being an absolute crucial move, as Virgin would pour support into the company immediately, almost too much support for Command & Conquer, allowing them to have access to the Dune IP as well, based on the popular sci-fi story or book turned movie. Oh, and there's also some modern movies too. The original Dune game was an adventure game by Cryo Interactive, who would then go on to create Frank Herbert's Dune, which would effectively bankrupt them due to its lack of success. After they were dissolved as a company, since Virgin was their primary funding, Virgin now had a major license and nothing to do with it. Brett Sperry would be approached by the Virgin president, Martin Alper. Virgin president, with the offer to use the Dune license. Sperry at the time had been arguing with another executive in the industry about the viability of strategy games in general, or wargaming style gaming. Dune 2 was effectively his bet that if you innovated on the formula and just made a better game, strategy gaming could still be popular. If you're wondering why Dune 2 was Dune 2, it was because during the development of the game, Cryo would actually rush their development of their game Dune, and thus dubbing the second game Dune 2. The Virgin offices were also familiar with arguably one of the first RTS-styled games ever, Herzog's Way, a Japanese commercial failure that was still incredibly innovative. The vice president of Virgin Interactive, Stephen Clark Wilson, knew about this and introduced it to the studio. This then allowed the Westwood Studios team, according to lead programmer Joe Bostick, to draw inspiration from the game, as well as some other games like Military Madness from 1989, and of course Civilization from 1991, just the year prior. This perfect storm led to the creation of Dune 2, an RTS, a real-time strategy game, not a turn-based one where turns would happen, like in some more modern D&D games, simultaneously. Dune 2 wasn't the first RTS, but it really helped popularize the genre for the first time. The gameplay consisted of controlling limited forces with the ability to individually select units and send them to attack enemy troops or structures. You then had to find spice, mine it, and use the resources that you got from it to build your units and structures. You could then select these structures to produce more units and send those units into battle, an integral part of the RTS genre, and really any RTS game. While Dune 2 now looks its age, it has the foundational aspects that made this genre what it is today, and you can see it even in the old school gameplay. The success of Dune 2 led to Westwood Studios having the desire to leave the sin, as they would say, since it's rough, of course, and just gets everywhere, I'm sure, and make something closer to a realistic, modern-feeling game. Initial ideas did tease something more spellcraft and fantasy-like, but the team would ultimately decide on a parallel world to ours, but featured our modern warfare gameplay and settings still. This distinction ended up being paramount, with their longtime competitor going forward, Blizzard, ending up gobbling the fantasy and sci-fi space with their Warcraft and Starcraft games, allowing the three titles to distinguish themselves from each other. The reason that Command & Conquer, often called Tiberian Dawn as well due to it being technically the first game in the Tiberium series, was such a smash hit in September of 1995 was because it basically took all of the aspects of Dune 2 and built upon them, on top of achieving a wish list of features that either didn't make it into that game or seemed like a natural evolution from it. Command & Conquer featured two campaigns for the two iconic factions that you would see in almost all of the games, the GDI, the Global Defense Initiative, and the Brotherhood of Nod. Command & Conquer was truly ahead of its time, featuring live-action full-motion video cutscenes, or FMV cutscenes, for the game's campaign, featuring Joe Kukan himself, who acted and played Kane, and also led the casting team.
Your efforts have landed us here, my faithful friend. The temple is complete, and we are about to embark upon our greatest exploit. Begin.
These ended up being an iconic part of the game on top of other aspects such as Maria del Mar Macready's installation prompt idea, and of course the game's stellar design backed by Eric Yo, Joe Bostick, and Bill or William Randolph. The soundtrack was composed by Frank Klepacki. The soundtrack was an eccentric blend of many genres that ended up capturing the iconic feel of the game series itself. Klepacki would even go on to help do the soundtrack for many different UFC and Spike UFC programmings. But Command & Conquer really is a story of success, teamwork, and ingenuity. featuring a rather small development team who was under 50 people and also extremely collaborative. This smaller team would help create a unique IP that would sell 3 million copies ultimately, which was not only unheard of at the time, it's still impressive today. CNC would get a version for nearly every platform, including the PlayStation 1, the Sega Saturn, the N64, which I mentioned before was my first entry into the game. But Command & Conquer put the idea that many kids and adults, let's be honest, had of playing with a bunch of toy soldiers digitally at a massive scale to reality. And it captured the hearts of many nerds, myself included. The first expansion, which would be a routine thing for the series going forward, would drop in April of 1996. CNC was a series molded by its expansions after all. This expansion would introduce a whopping 15 new missions and a new unique Easter egg mini-campaign with dinosaurs, which is just hilarious in hindsight especially. And there's over 5 mini-campaign missions featuring these dinosaurs too. While the first game was a Tiberium World game, the second full launch game, which many people still at the time treated more like an expansion, was Red Alert 1, which would drop November 1996 and was in the Red Alert world. This was effectively a prequel world to Tiberium. Red Alert was eventually fully spun off into a more lighthearted and comical series, while Tiberium would retain the classic science fiction and serious tone. RA really played up the differences of the factions instead of trying to balance things past a point. Red Alert was also successful, selling over 2 million copies and impressing critics on PC with a score of 91% out of 100. RA might be the oldest RA game, but it's probably rated the best, and it sold pretty respectively too. RA was seen as a huge upgrade to the original series and original game both visually and mechanics-wise, even if it was still sometimes seen as an expansion. That would change surely after Red Alert would receive its own expansions, Counter-Strike and Aftermath, released just months after each other. Both expansions were developed in tandem with Intelligent Games, a London-based studio. Counter-Strike would introduce new units that were only playable in the campaign, which ironically ended up being the same for the first expansions in Brood War and StarCraft, but with the ability to also fight against a new faction of enemies, the Giant Ants. Counter-Strike would also add some new maps for multiplayer, and Aftermath, also designed cooperatively with Intelligent Games, would introduce some new units playable in multiplayer, as well as some new maps. Now, both expansions are a little bit more so forgotten, but Counter-Strike was still quite successful, managing to sell over 500,000 copies worldwide, making it one of the fastest selling expansions of the time. Another cool tidbit is that Counter-Strike's maps were most famously designed by top ladder players from the previous Command & Conquer games, a practice actually that would become quite commonplace in RTS games going forward and would be extremely successful. Westwood Studios, as many might remember them for, was known for making all kinds of games spanning all kinds of genres, to varying levels of success, from Aladdin to Lion King to much, much more. But this fervor also allowed them to be fearless at times, attempting creative games even amongst their own existing IPs, which is what we saw with the spin-off deathmatch game, Command & Conquer Soul Survivor. This played more like a popular arcade game, or kind of even like that Kerrigan mission in StarCraft, where you had to survive as the sole survivor against very challenging odds. And of course, Red Alert Retaliation, which was actually a PS1 port of Red Alert. This title, much like the N64 port of CNC, and, well, StarCraft's N64 port, which I actually also played as well, were not favorably received, nor remembered, as they were essentially trying to play the most complex style of game in RTS played at a fast pace with the controller. Trust me, selecting units alone was a challenge in these types of games, including the PS1 port Retaliation, let alone things like attack moving or anything mechanical. These two titles, however, I wouldn't really have much negative to say about. They're two attempts at new ideas, and sometimes those just don't work out, especially when you're making up the rules as you go. I mean, Westwood Studios was making games on the spot and developing their proprietary Westwood engine at the same time. They were all essentially learning on the job, having to script and program everything from scratch. EA would acquire Westwood Studios from Mergent Interactive, who reportedly had lost money on it since acquisition. According to developer interviews, this could likely be due to the fact that they spent so much money to promote and support the Command & Conquer series, and they weren't really seeing a return on that investment yet. But EA wouldn't stop at just purchasing Westwood Studios and would purchase Virgin Interactive's US operations as well. EA, helmed by Lawrence F. Probst III, was on a purchasing spree after reaching great success bringing sports to gaming, and then acquiring Westwood Studios, and that would end up being very successful for them too, giving them the biggest RTS developer of the time. Although many can argue, and will likely argue in the comments below, about this acquisition eventually leading to many problems and potentially even being the major reason that the series suffered, EA actually reportedly early on didn't touch Tiberian Sun at all, which was in development at the time of the acquisition, and their influence even after that was largely fended off by founder Brett Sperry in general. But you can't really get mad at Westwood Studios. I mean, they were a company under Virgin, and Virgin got acquired, so they had little choice following the acquisition anyway. Tiberian Sun was the first EA-sponsored Command & Conquer game to release, August 27, 1999, and though its development was untouched by them, that development still suffered from multiple delays and cut content. In spite of this, the game was still a financial success, selling multiple millions of copies, though the fanbase was a bit more mixed on this one due to its technical issues. Tiberian Sun featured Adam P. Isgreen, a legendary developer in video game history, having worked on the likes of Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, Age of Empires 4, Killer Instinct, and even Star Wars Empire at War.
You're the fucking Messiah. You can't kill the Messiah.
Tiberian Sun was caught in between, where it featured this 2D and 3D looking mix of sprites, a style that seemed like a natural evolution of the time, but actually ended up being quite disliked. I mean, even so much so that Ultima and RuneScape, who also adopted the styles at one point, had to kind of either regress or adopt a new style instead. But the Firestorm expansion did actually add some cool and unique features that I wanted to mention. I mean, the World Domination Tour mode allowed you to play almost like a Risk-like type game. Firestorm also included FMV briefings for both factions this time and treated both campaigns as canon, which created, for almost the first time I think, a connected storyline. I think Firestorm, honestly, might be one of the best sleeper expansions. Bolstered now by programmer Henry Yu and the designer Dustin Broder, later known for his work on StarCraft 2 and many other RTS games, Red Alert 2, the sequel to RA, would drop October 23, 2000. While Red Alert 2 would still manage to sell around 3 million copies, the game suffered from a poor launch window, and the residual dislike of the previous Command & Conquer game. And to me, this is a bit of a shame. I mean, because RA2 has some of the better cutscenes in the entire series, and probably the best gameplay mechanics that were refined and introduced into the series yet. The differences between the Allies and Soviets are more pronounced now, and the gameplay felt more unique. You now had Allies and Soviets with different nations, each one of them having a unique unit. Fury's Revenge, the first and only expansion, would introduce yet more of this on top of a quality campaign featuring a new ex-Soviet threat. Yuri would even manage to win PC Gamer's Best Expansion of that year. All Command & Conquer mainline games, Red Alert or Tiberium, feature online play, and Red Alert 2 was no different. Though I think that it not only was one of the most popular online titles of the time, it's still probably the most played Command & Conquer game today. Westwood Studios would gamble again, this time on the idea that they would turn their Command & Conquer series into a 3D shooter. They would launch this shooter dubbed Command & Conquer Renegade February 2002. Renegade offers actually a lot of explorable parts of its levels and multiple approaches to them too. With unique weapons to choose from, you can take out the enemy, the Brotherhood of Nod in this case, as you play as a GDI commando as you see fit. Renegade fit this nice sci-fi near future feel where it doesn't feel over the top like all the time. You could even play in vehicles and tanks in the campaign and the like, though that also came with difficulty spikes where if you lost your vehicle, the game and level was almost impossible. Kind of reminds me of Jedi Outcast. Now, I don't even think that Renegade is a bad game, especially when you weigh that it had a multiplayer that looked a lot like Quake Wars, which came out like a whole 5 years later, where it played like a PlanetSide game, where you could buy vehicles and advanced character classes with resources that you would earn from playing the game. There's just two major factors that outside of the game that ended up affecting it very negatively. First, Renegade was seen as a failure by EA commercially, as was Earth and Beyond at the time, a Westwood MMO that failed quite quickly. Second, due to the popularity and explosion of Unreal Tournament and Halo, Renegade was just looking really bad commercially. These two failures would lead to EA allowing the Westwood Studios to be dissolved into what would become known as EA Los Angeles. But this would trigger mass layoffs at the company, leading to the departures of many key figures such as Brett Sperry, co-founder, Steve Wetherill, the game's technical director, and Joe Postic, the game's lead programmer. And honestly, much more. Some of these developers, led by Joe, would go on to form Petroglyph Games, who is actually still around today and would largely be known for their work on the Star Wars Empire at War game. And, ironically, more recently and later on, the remaster for the first 2 Command & Conquer games too. The others were led by Sperry, Adam Isgreen, and Raid Stayavovic.
American fools. Your intellect is as weak as your dollar.
Would form Jet Set Games. Now, perhaps if Renegade had the right time in the oven, it could have been a little bit better, but I think that it's also one of the most forgotten and underrated games of our generation. I mean, the multiplayer was so much fun, almost like too much fun. This would prompt Westwood Studios to release the SDK kit for the game that many modders would end up taking control of and start cooking up some insane mods. No better example of this than Totem Arts, who would chef up some mods for Unreal Tournament 3 featuring Renegade gameplay, and very likely could have been the inspiration for Quake Wars 2. This would even lead to an eventual standalone game much later on, Renegade X, which would also launch. There's even a newer game dubbed Firestorm seeming to take much of the same inspiration. This kind of stuff just doesn't happen, and in great success if there isn't some kind of quality there, but that double whammy of Earth and Beyond and Renegade's financial failures back-to-back likely just led to more swift action from EA. Although many of the OG devs had departed, some, such as Dustin Broder, remained and was now tasked with leading the next Command & Conquer project. This one featuring a brand new world dubbed Generals for the game of the same name, which featured the Renegade engine. The dev team took Red Alert 2 units and rendered them into the engine as a proof of concept initially. Generals was then set up to be in the actual real world and not a parallel world, which would then steep it in controversy. Generals was released February 2003 and was the first full 3D Command & Conquer game, which was quite the barrier to have to break so early on in the franchise's history. I mean, StarCraft had 10 years to practice for that after all. Generals would feature 3 factions this time, the United States, China, and the GLA, who focused on guerrilla warfare. Unlike previous Command & Conquer titles, many would argue that Generals is a further step into the other direction of its competition, featuring many Relic Entertainment features from Company of Heroes, and of course many features from Blizzard's games too, such as dedicated building units, 3 factions, and less pronounced differentials between the factions. While some would argue that Generals was the first time that Command & Conquer felt like a modern online multiplayer, I personally find Generals to be something like a Company of Heroes game for the Command & Conquer series, which isn't bad, but it wasn't the core CNC experience that most were familiar with. It was, however, many people's first CNC experience, and arguably the most balanced experience. Though, for many, myself included, the balance there wasn't even ideal since many of us just enjoy the stark differences in Command & Conquer. Those differences, though, certainly make it a little less competitive online, which is the idea behind Generals. And, well, their first expansion, 0 Hour, would just greatly expand upon the game and that, adding 15 new missions for the factions, including more sub-factions, and feature the classic CNC-style FMV scenes yet again. 0 Hour is another quality expansion to add to the long list of quality expansions in the Command & Conquer franchise. But something that I find interesting about Generals is despite its success on the surface, I don't really see much mention of its sales past a point. And since it didn't have a Steam presence until of late, there's very likely a world where Generals didn't recoup how much money was spent on it. But I think it probably did, just not overly enough. It is, however, still one of the most played CNC games despite being quite ancient. Reportedly, it didn't do well in Germany though, which might sound like a random thing to mention, but Germany was actually like one of their biggest, if not second biggest audience in all of Command & Conquer. That's due to the censorship and Generals getting renamed to General or Generale because the Federal Department of Media Harmful to Young People were just mad at the game because they felt like it was trivializing the war. Now this is kind of strange to me because Germany was the biggest, if not biggest audience for CNC, but now because they were featuring some clearly Germany-inspired characters with no parallel universe, there's drama. Now, regardless of why, and me thinking that that's a pretty silly reason to censor a game, this likely led to an overall decreased presence in Germany, one of the franchise's biggest audiences. Dustin Broder would depart for the competition, Blizzard, sometime in 2005, but not after cooking up yet another sleeper hit with the Lord of the Rings Battle for Middle-earth. Broder at Blizzard would go on to work on Heroes of the Storm and of course be the lead designer behind none other than StarCraft 2. And honestly, you can see many of his ideas from Generals, and see why some fans of the Command & Conquer series felt like it was a departure. The issue with EA's handling of the IP though, and the talent behind it was, well, they weren't really handling it well. I mean, look at like Firaxis or 2K Games and how they've had Civilization and Sid Meier on the hook for like 30 years. And Xbox has been hand in hand with Relic Entertainment behind Age of Empires and many other games for also ages. Yet EA at this point was just losing more and more of their talent, which just was gonna make it more difficult to try to catch up to the competitors. It would later come out that Earth and Beyond wasn't the only MMO failure for Westwood Studios, and they would also reportedly cancel development behind the scenes on a new MMO set in the Command & Conquer universe dubbed Continuum. This game was supposed to feature unique gameplay for the genre and introduce content similar to modern-day raid content. The gameplay was described as being more action-centric and likely having aspects that would mimic from the Renegade game first, and would likely have mimicked aspects of Renegade's gameplay. But the project sadly was cancelled following Westwood Studios' termination. And some would argue that Westwood's demise wasn't just due to them trying too many things, but also trying to heavily hitch their wagon to the MMO industry a bit too early.
Perhaps you should rethink your career choice, Commander.
That's a genre, as many of you detectives know, that, well, not only is the most complex of the genres, but also required a crazy endurance to persist past initial failures and ignorance in the market, and EA historically hasn't really had that with Virtual Worlds as they displayed with Ultima. Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars would drop March 26, 2007, led by Jason Bender and Greg Black. Tiberium Wars wasn't just a return to the world of Tiberium, but a return to form for the series. According to Steam, Tiberium Wars would sell nearly 2 million copies and is rated very positive there by players on aggregate review websites with a 90+ user score. Command & Conquer 3 is fast-paced without feeling too far off of the original Command & Conquer formula. It also features a bigger jump into the sci-fi direction with nukes, special bombs, mech suits, lasers, and more. But it felt like a natural progression for the series and, well, Tiberium, especially with the introduction of the third faction, the Skrin, who felt like a Covenant-adjacent race in a good way. The only issue that I think persisted with Command & Conquer 3 was online with its longevity, and I think that that's due to the game being so different futuristically to where people kind of just got bored with it and went back to the classic Command & Conquer experiences after it. But Kane's Wrath, the game's expansion, might be the best expansion we've seen yet. Not only does it introduce more backstory for the beloved and hated Kane character, the most popular character in the series, it also allows you to play the unique Global Conquest mode and introduced new sub-factions. In my opinion, Global Conquest as a mode is one of the coolest modes I've ever seen in an RTS game, as it's a mode that bridges the gap between long-form Risk-like games or 4X games and faster-paced RTS gameplay. This is something that I've honestly been searching for ages, where you can have regional control and influence with a global map, but also zoom in and actually participate in the combat yourself. You could even auto-simulate on the large maps too. CNC3 was just great, but Kane's Wrath was even greater, designed by Warren Capps, who would then go on to work with VR Gaming, and Samuel Bass, who would work on Fortnite, and is a technical designer for Epic Games. The talent that's worked on the Command & Conquer series is just endless, and I can't possibly cover everyone, so I'm sorry. But more impressively to me is that many of these developers would go on to create many more successful games too. Command & Conquer wouldn't give up on making a hit FPS game though, reportedly working on what would become known later on as Tiberium, a new FPS shooter in the Command & Conquer universe for 2 years before a leak would happen at the beginning of 2008. Tiberium was being sold essentially as the Republic Commando for the Command & Conquer IP. The only issue is that Republic Commando came out 3 years prior. The leaks showcased a game that seemed to be a little mediocre at worst. Tiberium was playable in limited test sessions, and some of these gameplay sessions are actually now public online. The cinematics, cutscenes, or what little is shown doesn't really look bad, but the gameplay is just limited, and what was shown outside of that is just, it's not that great. I think another crew shooter could have worked. It's not like Republic Commando's the only and should be the only one, which is already sad in itself, but Tiberium reportedly never got that far into development development due to the inability to translate aspects of the Command & Conquer series into the game, and, well, just a lack of direction. I think a Tiberium Republic Commando could still work, but Tiberium didn't. As according to the EA spokesperson at the time, Miriam Sugayer, the game was not on track to meet the high-quality standards set by the team and by the EA Games label, and thus the project was cancelled. But that wasn't the only project that EA would cancel that year too, with the cancellation of yet another Command & Conquer project, this time simply known as Project Camacho. This project was set to be an RTS FPS hybrid, which is actually ironic, when Savage 2 would launch in 2008 and was exactly that style of game. Savage 2 was incredibly fun, and a unique game, and probably one of the most fun and unique games I've played. However, it was pretty janky, and being built by somebody without EA's large pocketbook, and it also was just complex due to it also being an action game and an RTS game at the same time. Now I'm sad about this cancellation, because besides Savage the Battle for New Earth and its sequel Savage 2, there haven't really been that many games like this attempted. Red Alert 3, the final Red Alert game from Command & Conquer as of 2025, would drop October 28th, 2008.
I was wrong about how good you are. Hey, you're not a red, are you?
This game tragically only had about 18 months of development time, and this could be seen with the game's poor pathfinding and netcode.
You've rained on my glorious parade.
Wait.
For this, I'm sending everything I've got at you. But I won't let you have the satisfaction of catching me.
Red Alert 3 had the biggest budget yet, featuring major actors like J.K. Simmons, Tim Curry, and even George Takei as leaders of the three factions in the game. The game really focuses on a cooperative approach, which is pretty neat to be honest when playing with friends, but due to the game also being always online, when you played it by yourself, you had to play with a random AI commander as your teammate, so it was kind of like a catch. I think it affects the replayability due to such, and that was probably why RA3 was less popular than RA2. What I can say about RA3 though is that while it's the most visually striking of the RA series and has the biggest budget, I think it also showcases the cracks that I talked about earlier, where the missions and design and complexity are just less there, and they even simplified things like mining. The mechanics of the game also just don't really feel particularly balanced compared to RA2. RA3 felt like it wanted to drive up the silliness even more to the next umpteenth level, but at some point it just reaches a ceiling, you know? I mean, like, talking tanks? But it's hard to be not compared to your own series just because, well, you're a prequel game or you're in a different world within that series. The first and only expansion for Red Alert 3, I think, is more proof of this. Launched March 2009, Uprising might have added new content, but the content was largely repurposed ideas from previous CNC games.
The world is still not secure, Commander. It is time for you to fulfill your duty.
And the expansion is really just a collection of well-made scenarios, essentially. It's like they spent all of their money on the base game and all of the marketing behind it. This is where I have to acknowledge one of the big weaknesses of the Command & Conquer series. When compared to their competitor Blizzard with both Warcraft and Starcraft, many aspects that were sold in expansions in Command & Conquer were custom games for free in Warcraft or Starcraft. Speaking of which, the sheer amount of custom games offered in those games by comparison was just much greater, whether campaigns, multiplayer modes, and more. It was just insane with Battle.net, with the whole toolset system that was released to players. Meanwhile, Command & Conquer sometimes released toolsets, but was split across multiple games on different servers. It didn't have the same continuity, nor content that the other games could boast, and by 2009 that could be felt. Oh, and Command & Conquer also tried esports and had a scene that was still to some degree popular, but it was nothing in size compared to the Blizzard scene even in just Korea alone. Some would argue that this is due to the game lacking complexity and macro play. Red Alert 3, ultimately, however, was not only not positively received as much as the first two, it's less popular than Red Alert 2 even in modern times. Sadly though, with RA3 being the last serious entry, and, well, somewhat successful CNC title, it left a legacy that was more easily forgotten. By the end of 2009, while the series reached an impressive total of 30 million copies sold, many of the remaining OG talent had departed more recently, such as the last co-founder Lewis Castle and the lead developer Greg Black, who would then go to work with Blizzard on Diablo, while Lewis would do a few things before ultimately joining none other than Amazon Game Studios. There were actually many reports that these developers departed not because of randomness, but because of a disagreement behind closed doors. And this would seem to be backed up by more reports later on, signaling that, well, the blunder that was about to happen next, and next with the franchise, was self-inflicted by none other than EA themselves. EA Los Angeles, which was what was remaining of Westwood Studios, was originally working on a game that was designed only for the Asian pro gaming market. This game was called Command & Conquer Arena, but later on, due to some EA-level executive meddling, the game would then be rebranded as a Tiberium game dubbed Tiberium Twilight in an effort to boost the game's sales. Originally known, as I mentioned, by Command & Conquer Arena, which is more fitting for the game by design. That's why after fans found out that it didn't have a campaign, they got so mad that EA started demanding a campaign from the development team who had only been working on the game for like a year. Because of its market focus, Tiberium Twilight was free to play, and was only playable online. But many decisions about the game besides these aforementioned issues would cause even more dislike for the game, such as the complete removal of base building and resource gathering. This, again, makes sense if the game is an arena game, but now it's being sold as the fourth Command & Conquer game. A massive blunder that would do irreparable damage to the series as a whole, and one that EA Los Angeles would then be punished for despite it actually being their executive EA's fault. The worst thing about CNC4, besides the lackluster campaign, regressive mechanics, and always online DRM, was the fact that the game had pay-to-win aspects. You could actually use currencies to purchase units. This is a type of progression system that would then end up being used in Age of Empires Online as well, but however, is disliked by pretty much all RTS fans, especially the multiplayer-centric ones, which is probably why Age of Empires Online also found itself in my series as well, as it flies against what the genre audience is used to, with such a game with units locked away by progression that makes it even easier to unlock by just spending money. That means you could get rocked by units you can't even play with. CNC4 was the first pay-to-win Command & Conquer, officially, in my opinion, but it wasn't the last. EA Phenomic of Spellforce and Battleforge fame would be tasked with the next Command & Conquer game. But this time, instead of a first-person shooter or a main series RTS, this was a spin-off game, Tiberium Alliances, which was also still a strategy game, but a browser strategy game? Actually, don't get me wrong, I'm actually a big supporter of this type of idea. I mean, I used to play an old browser game from the early 2000s named Artifact, which functioned much like this one did, with time dilation, or just having protection for a week, and the ability to play, well, a strategy game with mass amounts of players on a massive map. The issue being that the game basically only monetizes through pay-to-win aspects, if it does at all. And who was looking for a browser RTS style game in 2012? Phenomic, which had its HQ in Germany, was then later shut down October 2013. They're worthy of getting their own story told too, as not only did they make some really interesting games, they made some incredibly flawed ones in their tenure under and before EA. With the success of Generals, a sequel was then erected and announced back in 2011. However, within just 2 years, a bomb would drop on the web concerning the sequel, which would then be cancelled. Generals 2 was supposed to be developed by Victory Games, who was also known as BioWare Victory. This was a studio only formed back in 2011, but led by John Van Canham, the creator of the Might and Magic series. Victory was then erected as the future Command & Conquer developers, with most of the remaining EA Los Angeles team having been let go after the failure of CNC4. The idea was that Command & Conquer, which it was simply being known as at the time, was almost like to remake the series, and would get this big BioWare story treatment on top of a modernization of the series. However, after showcasing and even advertising some of this, Generals 2 would then be repurposed into a free-to-play game without a single-player campaign. And this would be met with the same pushback as the previous CNC failure, and thus the EA president of the time, Frank Gabot, would promise a campaign. It's like Electronic Arts has had the IP now for like 10 plus years and they still don't know that the majority of the fan base wants to play a single player game too. CNC, now known as Generals 2, would go quiet for a while before releasing some video footage concerning the game in 2012, and then suddenly, after a closed alpha test, would suddenly be cancelled citing poor feedback. That feedback reportedly was largely centered around the dislike for the game's multiplayer, which was the only testable part yet, and well, the fact that the game was free to play yet again, eliciting PTSD for many fans. I think this was a delicate and difficult situation for Victory Games. I mean, they were making a Generals game after all, so the focus on small armies and more tactical squad-like gameplay, like a game like Company of Heroes, was just par for the course. But with the failure of CNC4 and no recent Red Alert games, fans were probably just angrier at this, since it meant that they weren't getting the type of game that they wanted. Worse, I actually think that there is a world where the game could have been free to play. I mean, we've seen it work for StarCraft too. The problem is that the fan base, understandably so, didn't have faith that Electronic Arts was going to do it right. But anyway, back to my Company of Heroes comparisons, it's hard not to see them whenever you pay attention to Generals or Generals 2 especially. Like, the game looks good, but then you think for yourself, does everyone who plays Command & Conquer want to play Company of Heroes? And that's probably why the fan bases for these games have been pretty split. Generals 2 looked pretty good though, but pretty good didn't seem to be good enough for EA, who had the vision of making Generals 2 a long-term live service game with episodic content, and even feature a single-player campaign. This would make it thus on par with their competition StarCraft 2, which had just launched a few years prior, and completely smashed Command & Conquer, selling like 6 to 7 million copies. That's because StarCraft 2 offered what Generals 2 did, in many ways, and more, like the classic StarCraft army building experience and resource management. And thus I think that's why it was more positively received than more recent CNC games. But that's kind of the problem of losing the essence of what makes your game what it is, and thus the franchise what it is. Over time, you start to lose all the talent that also makes that possible, further making it difficult to synthesize what it means or feels to play a Command & Conquer game. But for many fans, the more recent games just weren't unique, and was the franchise's way of trying to be just like other games, more so than being itself. Taking factional abilities from Age of Empires, unit power-ups from Company of Heroes, and much more examples. We wouldn't see another Command & Conquer game for like 5 years, and when we did see one, it was actually coming from EA Redwood Studios, also known as the recently shut down Visceral Games behind the Dead Space series. This game though was mobile only, and it was a battle arena style game, not an RTS. Now, I like battle arena games, as many of you probably know. And I don't think that Rivals is actually a bad game, but I hate the dialogue surrounding the game, especially coming from the previous co-founder at Westwood, Lewis Castle himself, stating that they couldn't just understand why the fan reception to the game was so negative. What? You don't know why your own fanbase is mad at you? That seems like you lack a serious amount of awareness even outside of the game in particular. But with Rivals, it's not playable on PC, and nearly all modern popular mobile games are also playable on PC, where, by the way, your entire catalog is, by the way, Command & Conquer. That's the mistake. You made a bunch of major flops, and then you have this arrogance in which you just can't seem to understand why your audience is mad about it. It's no wonder that fans would reject Rivals, even if it was designed by Greg Black and other veteran CNC devs. Perception and community interaction matter, and if you're not going to say sorry and try to deliver your apology in the form of a wishlist-based game, which is exactly what the original CNC was, the audience is just gonna be peed.
Your defeat is at hand.
But just when it felt like Command & Conquer as a series really was on the way out, for good, because they couldn't even keep their die-hard fans of the franchise happy, a remastered collection would be announced and helmed by mostly the OG squad, and would not only feature the first Command & Conquer, but also Red Alert. This collection would drop June 5th, 2020, and has been rated incredibly positively. The game's been fully remastered in 4K, including all of the expansions, sounds, and even the music. This is the first win for the series in almost like a decade, coming at a perfect time when the temperature for remasters was pretty good. Petroglyph really was in full form, assisted by Malaysian studio Lemon Sky Studios on things like graphics and animations. Bostic was back, Klepaki was on the soundtrack, Steve Tall was with tech and more. The success alone wasn't the only good news, but it was also good news for CNC as a series, since it could also signal more potential remasters or even remakes. But that was also good for Petroglyph too, who was still chugging after all of these years, and also happened to be working on an FPS game set in an RTS world. This is an elusive idea that we mentioned earlier, that many RTS developers have been trying to make for decades and failing. That game, dubbed Earthbreakers, isn't out yet, but it looks and sounds fairly unique and promising, and a pretty good use of Petroglyph's talent. And since I'm personally invested in this kind of idea, I wish them the best. Petroglyph has been a staple in the RTS world after all. Before I finish this video up, I had to make note and follow where the founders of Westwood Studios ended up, Lewis Castle and Brett Sperry. Sperry would make a few games and then go on to spend a lot of time working on arts, galleries, and successful constructions. Lewis Castle would stay largely in gaming, even joining AGS back in 2017. Wait, AGS has an Amazon Game Studios? Yes, that's right. Castle would be there whenever they tried Breakaway, and that never launched, and when they did Crucible, and that twice launched and then failed epically. Yeah, and then of course New World, which he would then hold water for multiple times, with that game's big initial success and then falling off of a cliff. Interestingly enough, in a GDC interview, I could sense that Castle and Sperry just didn't not work together by chance, but seemed to have contrasting personalities that also made that the case. Sperry seemed to be the perfectionist type, focused on a smaller array of things quite deeply, while Castle seemed to make all kinds of games and ideas and proclamations, even seeing such as a part of the process of just making good business. The reason I mention any of this, besides putting a bow on this story with the coverage of the founders, is that Castle was the head behind AGS, and AGS was one of the biggest, highest profile gaming failures we have seen yet. Especially New World, a game that spent half or more than $500 million and unlikely made that return back. Sorry, Castle, you can't just espouse things in your GDC talk so regularly, meanwhile hold water for failures like New World. Now the bow on top is that Castle would admit that he wasn't even really involved in Command & Conquer in the first place, to be fair, but it doesn't sound like he tries that hard to convince people otherwise. It's like the Woz and Jobs all over again. EA would later drop the original Command & Conquers for free, in the form of releasing the source code for Command & Conquer, Red Alert, Generals, Zero Hour, the expansion, and Renegade. Something that was quite unprecedented, to be honest, and a sign that some could argue could be a sign of more to come for the Command & Conquer series. Or perhaps just a way to score some easy brownie points as a corporation. You know. Regardless, releasing the source code was pretty cool of EA. Oh no, bad guy does good thing. Well, detectives, the music is playing and my voice is dying. You know what that means.
Don't congratulate yourselves just yet. I'm raising the alert level again. Now you'll get a real fight.
This special Grande-esque case has come to an end, and we have covered a dozen plus Command & Conquer games over the course of 20 plus years. And although there are plenty of successes on that timeline, we focus more so in this series on the reasons for a series or games not doing particularly well. And in the case of Command & Conquer, we have a genre-defining series largely left as a footnote in the modern world. The series has seemingly been on the fritz now for well over a decade, and without the recent success of the remaster, things would be even worse. And so, how did Command & Conquer, such an iconic series, find itself worse off than many of its stablemates? It had so many sequels, spin-offs, and expansions. It's honestly a bit of a hard series to follow. The changing of hands, masters, and ultimately, desires. The failure to modernize the game. Westwood shot a lot, like a Wild West shooter, and without fear. That led to a lot of misses. EA's constant and not so helpful meddling. Multiple failed projects in the series. Time caught up to the most successful games in the series. Now, let's be honest, RTS games as a whole aren't in their heyday right now. Not when that heyday used to involve multiple major games launching like every year. While Age of Empires lingers around with their 4th iteration and their insanely popular Definitive Edition 2, they aren't nearly as popular as they've been at their peak. In StarCraft 1 and 2, you have the Tale of Two Worlds, a Western world assuming that the second game is more popular simply because, check notes, it's more recent, and the Eastern world being the wiser, and playing StarCraft 1 so much that it dwarfs not only just the second game globally, but like most games including almost every RTS game. As StarCraft 1 continues to be a top-played PC Bang game. Though, now we have reports of yet another StarCraft game being planned. The point being though, these two major competitors might not be at their peak, but they're still kicking, and they still have some level of hope left both